faster than a speeding bullet,
I ran until my muscles burned and my veins pumped battery acid.
more powerful than a locomotive.
An idea is like a virus, resilient, highly contagious.
Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Hey guys, Jared Moon here from Into 3 Fitness, and welcome to the Better Humanology Podcast. This week, we have Dr. Ben Bikman back on the podcast. Definitely recommend going back and checking out his first episode because this is a follow-up. Some questions I wish we could have gone deeper on and some things that I wish we could have discussed a little bit more is what I bring up. So go listen to the first episode, then listen to this one. But things that we cover today, ketosis, low carb, and the plagues of prosperity. All right, Dr. Bikman, I am super pumped to have you back on the Better Humanology Podcast, man. Welcome.
Thank you, Jared. I am delighted to be here.
All right, so we're going to get started with the challenges. You threw down some pretty good ones last time. Do you want me to remind you about what they were?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
but I'll have different ones this time, but I'm curious.
And for anyone listening, Dr. Bikman, by far one of my favorite interviews so far. So if you guys want to listen to our first conversation, go search back our feed. We had a really great talk, and I know we will again today. So last time we did a fitness challenge, mental toughness challenge, and book recommendation. Your fitness challenge was to try out some more eccentric movements in training and really focus on that. Your mental toughness challenge was, don't, especially in parenting and all relationships, you said don't react in anger. Do your best to take that moment. And then also your book recommendation was Wandering into the Gardens of the Mind. And so those were the three recommendations you had for us last time. So you want to mix it up or stay the same with your challenges this episode?
No. Let's go through them again.
All right. So how about a fitness challenge?
Yeah. So one thing I've been paying more attention to that it's been fun and challenging. It's actually helped me kind of get over a little bit of a hump. Is when I do any sort of pull-up work on the bar, don't rely on anything to prevent you from swinging. In other words, make sure you're going with such control at such a pace and in such good form that you don't start swinging back and forth when you're doing any work on the bar. So be deliberate and controlled enough to not swing and not need to tap your toe on something to stop the swinging.
All right, so we're just removing all momentum from your movement. And
Yeah, right. Yeah, well said. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, and so how about a mental toughness challenge?
Yeah, here's one that I've been working on lately. And again, it sort of comes back to my role as a husband and father first and foremost. But it is this maxim that my dad would often tell me as a boy, and now it's sort of hitting home. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. And so what I'm working on lately is if my kid is just going banana balls for whatever reason, it's to actually, let him or her, say what they need to say without me trying to interrupt and try to satisfy or address the problem before they've actually had a full chance to express it. And then if I have something to say, well, let them say it first. So I want to make sure that I've understood my child or my wife or anyone else, but them in particular, before, I want to be selfless enough to have that communication where they say what they need to say. I make sure I'm actually trying to understand it. And then I'll say my piece if needed. And frankly, by the time I've listened to them, what I thought I needed to say, I might not need to anymore.
I really like that. I love your challenges, and and I could just tell as a person, you're really focused on being the best husband and father that you can possibly be, and I really respect that.
Thank you. Well, at the end of my life, I figure that'll matter more than anything else.
Right? All right, so how about a book recommendation this time around?
Yeah, so I'm actually reading a couple. I find that I just have I'm distractible enough that it's hard to focus on just one. So the book that I'm really enjoying, and I think the average listener would enjoy too, it's called Oxygen, the Molecule That Made the World by Nick Lane. And because my PhD was bioenergetics, and that gave me an appreciation for energy, which actually ends up being a focus on how carbon moves, how the sun provides energy for the plant to fix carbon dioxide as carbon. An animal, humans included, will eat that carbon from the plant. And then even if say the herbivore is eating the grass, which is what the ground would naturally make, and then we eat the herbivore, nevertheless, it is this sort of flow of where did the carbon go next? So this molecule touches on that a little, but it's nevertheless an appreciation of the relevance of oxygen and its part in making the world as we know it. It's really quite fascinating.
That sounds like a great book. I'm definitely going to check that out. I appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, you'll enjoy it.
All right, so last time we really dove into caloric theory versus endocrine theory, and we did talk about insulin versus ketones, things of that nature. And now I wanted to have you back on the show to kind of get an update where you've been, what you're doing, what you're passionate about. But let's start just real quick. If you could give people who may have just found the show a quick introduction, who you are and what you do for a living.
Yeah, you bet. So I'm a professor and a scientist at BYU. I say professor and scientist because this is primarily an undergraduate institute, which means I do have a teaching assignment. So I teach pathophysiology, which is the study of how the body gets sick, which is a lot of fun because my role as a scientist is to study diabetes and obesity. And that has, over time, led me to an appreciation and thus a research focus on insulin resistance, the relevance of insulin in disease. Traditional medicine is so indifferent to insulin that it's rare to be able to even get insulin measured on a typical blood test. When you go to your annual checkup and you ask your physician to measure your insulin, you may get resistance for that. It's very ignored. And the tragedy is that insulin resistance is the single most common disease worldwide, and it masks itself as virtually every other chronic disease, what I like to call the plagues of prosperity. You look at pretty much any plague of prosperity, the diseases that are killing us nowadays, the chronic diseases, and insulin resistance is either causing it directly or it's making it worse. And so I consider that one of the errors of typical medicine, that we overlook insulin. But nevertheless, so my research focus looks at the pathological side or the dangerous side of insulin, and that over time has given me an appreciation and academic focus on ketones as well. But with both of them, it's always revolving around a metabolic component. How are the mitochondria working? I mean, how are the neurons working? The mitochondria in the neurons. So whatever I'm doing with insulin or ketones, there's always a metabolic component to it.
And I'm sure you've seen, as I have since our last conversation, the popularity of ketosis has been growing exponentially. I'm sure that you've been getting a lot more requests and to speaking opportunities, all these different things. I'm sure that a lot of that has come up. I would just like to get, this is non-scientific, just your opinion. Why do you think ketosis is gaining so much ground in popularity?
Yeah, I've been wondering the same thing. So my own pathway towards appreciating ketones came because of my appreciation of insulin. So it is interesting to sort of see, at least in my mind, it may be overly simplified, two populations where on one hand, there's people that just sort of go after the ketones. It's this a ketogenic diet for the sake of the ketones, and yet without much of an appreciation or understanding of really what's going on behind the scenes. And for me, I came to an appreciation of ketones through my research on insulin, that finding we have to be in a state that's controlling insulin to be metabolically healthy. That same state happens to be a ketogenic state, insofar as when insulin is low, there's no inhibition of ketogenesis, and so the liver begins just pumping out ketones like gangbusters. So why this modern appreciation, we'll call it, for ketones, I'd like to think it's simply because the sheer amount of data that have been accumulated over the decades just can't be bottled up anymore. It seems like conventional medicine or pop culture appreciation of diet has been always low fat, low calorie. And as you know very well, that was really based more on dogma than it was on data. Even at the time in the 70s, when that sentiment really blew up, anti-fat sentiment, it was still in the face of conflicting evidence. We just don't know all those details that never kind of made it to the light of day. But the sheer amount of data just cannot be ignored anymore. And so I personally know, just within 10 miles of where I live here in Utah, in Provo, half a dozen or more physicians that the moment they have a patient come in and the patient has a primarily a metabolic issue, and that can include a lot of things that people wouldn't consider as metabolic, like certain fertility problems, they put them on low-carb diets immediately. And it's been very gratifying to have conversations with those physicians, and also to see the enthusiasm that the physician has when they see that their patients are coming in, and rather than upping the dose of their medications like they used to every subsequent visit, the patient would come back every 6 months, and the only thing that would happen is they'd see, oh, you're worse, let's up your dose. And now for the first time, the physicians have that gratification to say, all right, let's lower your dose, and let's lower it again, and hey, let's just take you off it entirely. So anyway, to answer your question, I think it's because the data can't be ignored, and in many instances, people are desperate enough to give this a try and say, oh, why not? I'll give this a try, and they see the results, and you can't argue with the results.
And one thing that really stuck out in my mind last time was we kind of talked about ketosis, but then I asked if you thought everyone should be on a ketogenic diet, and you said that wasn't necessarily your view. It was more about controlling insulin. And one thing that you mentioned was, and we didn't dive into it, and that's why I want to dive into it this time, was time restricted eating was one recommendation on top of controlling breakfast. So could we dive into why you might want to do time restricted eating to improve your health?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. I was just having a conversation with this with some students about this yesterday, where as you know, as this interest in ketones has blossomed, so too has this phenomenon of intermittent fasting, which I think there's a tremendous justification for the interest in that. And I have a lot of respect for the people that have made that become part of the conversation. I think that's important. Nevertheless, I sometimes worry when people may jump into intermittent fasting without really getting informed. It's not something that I would be comfortable talking about or encouraging someone to do until they really appreciated the need to carefully be monitoring electrolyte intake to avoid something called the refeeding syndrome, which is potentially lethal, but it's all about what happens to the ions once you start eating again, and it's very much related to insulin. So nevertheless, that's a fascinating topic, and we can dive into it more. But I find that intermittent fasting has come to be defined as pretty much what anyone wants it to be.
Right.
You can define it any way you want. It's like the Mediterranean diet. It's just, you call it whatever you want. You mix your diet macros up a little bit and you call it the Mediterranean diet because you had some olives, and okay, sure, everyone has their own definition for it. But with intermittent fasting, to me, I define that, just for the sake of a common vernacular, as a multi-day or something that is one day and more. Whereas, and that's something someone can do, but they need to be a bit strategic about it. The time-restricted eating is a term that I am more comfortable using because it defines more accurately what I typically do, and that works with my lifestyle and the people that I know well and discuss this with, where it's maybe one or two meals, or where you have a window in the day where, all right, I have a 6 hour or 8 hour window and I get my calories then. And the benefit to that is that you just have expanded that period of time when insulin isn't bumping up with every meal. I mean, now in today's world, people have been told and think they need to eat every 6 hours. And that has to be the worst advice that we ever give someone who's trying to lose weight, or let alone a type 2 diabetic or someone with insulin resistance, where you are bumping up your insulin, and then right as it's coming down 2 hours later, you're bumping it up again, and it's just coming down and getting back to fasting levels, and you bump it up again. It is the worst thing to do if someone's trying to control insulin and improve their cardiometabolic health. And thus, having one of the meals at the end of the day or beginning of the day, whether it's breakfast or whether it's dinner, have that be a meal that you fast through, the food fast through, and then you've just expanded that period of time where insulin stays low, and you may need to make up for that by eating more. So I don't intend for this to be a mechanism of calorie restriction. It may be, but it does not need to be. To me personally, it's more important that I have a longer period of time where insulin is low, and that means my mitochondria are going to be better. That means my brain is going to be clearer, where I've kind of given it a break off of glucose, and it's going to eat primarily ketones for a period of time. Whatever it may be, the benefits are myriad, and that's what I'm trying to capture with this time-restricted eating. And that, you can also get that with the multi-day fast, but I like to use those terms differently, with intermittent fasting being a day or more, and then time-restricted eating being within a 24-hour period. You've compressed your eating time down to a narrower window.
And what if you could just on intermittent fasting real quick? You said that it could be dangerous. Could you talk about that just a little bit more?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so there's a phenomenon called the refeeding syndrome, and that's where someone has gone through a period of a lack of food, and what's been happening then, on one hand, among many other things, insulin has come down, absolutely, and that is to me the biggest benefit of a fasting period. Insulin's come down. As insulin has come down, we also have potassium getting dropped out of the body a little bit. We start to lose some of our ions, and potassium's one of them, where we start to urinate these out a little more readily. And that's the importance, as anyone knows, on low carb, where you have to be replacing your electrolytes so diligently. It's because as insulin's come down, we're losing ions more readily and water with those ions. So we've got to replenish that. Nevertheless, we've been losing potassium. As insulin comes back up suddenly when a person starts eating, one of the many effects is that insulin starts driving potassium from the blood into the cells. And so here's my blood compartment, here's my cell, where insulin's pushing the potassium into the cell. And that's fine. The cell is the main reserve of potassium in the body. And so the cell sort of gets its potassium stock back, but it comes at the expense of the blood. And so then we have the risk of becoming acutely hypokalemic. And that's the clever term for blood potassium has gone too low. One of the consequences of that, of becoming hypokalemic, is that we push up the resting membrane potential of our cells, of any of our cell membranes, our nerves, the heart. And so we're closer to this, what's called the action potential. When we're firing a muscle, it's because we have enough signals that we've overcome the action potential of the nerve innervating that muscle, and now we get the contraction. So someone can run the risk of hypokalemia and have atrial fibrillation and die from basically a heart attack, all because of this, what had been a very prolonged period of low insulin and a new way of regulating ions, sort of a new normal. We suddenly mix that up by this rapid or this sudden consumption of calories again. So when someone is fasting, they need to make sure that they are keeping stock of their electrolytes, but second, do not end the fast on something that's going to spike your insulin dramatically. Sort of work up to it and be strategic. So that's my point. You can do an intermittent fast and it can have tremendous benefits, but it's not something you just shrug your shoulders and say, I'm going to do it. Yeah, I'm going to do it for 2 days. And when I get done, then I'm going to eat that cinnamon roll. Now, despite my affection for cinnamon rolls, don't do it that way. And so that's my only concern, when people just jump in without being strategic about it. The refeeding syndrome is a very real phenomenon that can be lethal to the point of death.
Wow. And that's something good to note, because fasting is becoming more popular. And I think with all of these, strategies in the health space, you definitely need to come prepared. And
yeah, that's right.
All right. So let's move into ketosis a little bit, because I know before the podcast, we talked a little bit about your new interest in research in the relation between protein, insulin, and ketosis. So could we dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So this has been a lot of fun for me, something that became a personal interest, in part because of my own interest in low carb diets, yet a determination to stay strong, because there is this apparent that's a paradox in some people's eyes. You can't possibly stay strong and eat low carb, and that ends up leading to a discussion about protein. And because I was hearing so much about this in the social media realm, where there's a lot of interest in protein and its place in a low carb diet. And I say a lot of interest, I could just as well say there's a lot of fear of protein, and I don't think that's justified. And so I started diving into the research, and it was a lot of fun. It's kind of a history lesson, really, where I ended up going back and reading a lot of papers by Dennis McGarry and Roger Unger. Dennis McGarry has passed away. Roger Unger is still alive and kicking. He still works even at UT Southwestern down in Dallas. But these are just legends in the field of insulin and glucagon research. And what I found, and what I'll be talking about at Low Carb Breckenridge in March is, so here's a spoiler, is that we always say, so when we look at the 3 macronutrients and what they're doing to insulin and glucagon, the common story is you eat carbohydrate and insulin goes up, glucagon goes down. That's absolutely true. If you eat a bolus of pure carbohydrate, pure glucose, that's what will happen. Insulin will go up, glucagon will come down. If you eat a bolus of pure fat, insulin will do nothing, and glucagon will go up. And that's a good thing for someone who's concerned with weight and staying metabolically healthy. And then in protein, we typically say insulin goes up and glucagon goes up. And that's a sort of interesting mix, because those 2 hormones are, in a way, sort of opposites in a way. And indeed, that situation is exactly what happens in a person who has elevated levels of glucose. If an individual has already fasting levels of fasting glucose levels that are higher than normal, and or they're eating protein with a glucose source, insulin goes up a lot. And I'm talking, it'll go up 3 or 4 times, 180 microunits, which is substantial for insulin when you consider that the average person's fasting insulin is around 10. It'll go up into the high hundreds, up into 200s potentially, just from a protein source. And glucagon will go up too. Glucagon will go up about 2 or 3 times. However, if you eat that same bolus of protein, and in the studies I'm thinking of, it was like a hamburger patty, like 1 gram with 1 gram per kilogram of protein in that one meal. So I'm about 70 kilos. I was getting 70 grams of protein, and that's how they did it. And when they found that when a person was in a low carb state, eating a low carbohydrate diet and or fasted, and so very low insulin levels and a normal level of glucose, and so we're talking around 70 to 80 milligrams per deciliter glucose, or around 5 millimolar or so, they found that the protein bolus did nothing to their insulin. There was no significant effect. It took that person's fasting insulin, on average, it went from 3 microunits up to 9. So about a 6-point change, but it was not statistically significant. So we have to say there was no change. And again, this was in contrast to the same bolus of protein fed in the presence of someone who already had higher glucose levels. Then the insulin went from around 60 was their fasting insulin at the time, and it went up to 180 or something. So this huge increase in insulin that was statistically significant. So we say that protein is insulinogenic. And mind you, that actually also depends on the amino acids that constitute the protein. Different amino acids have different effects on insulin. But if we look at the most insulinogenic, like arginine in these people that were low carb and or fasted, it did not increase their insulin. And that needs to be appreciated, where people are afraid of protein. They may be putting themselves in a diet that is avoiding protein to their detriment. And so one of the consequences, as I've been preparing this talk over the past few months, is that I scrutinized my own diet and realized that my love of fat was actually coming at the expense of protein. And so I've shifted my focus around where I'm making sure that I'm getting around 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And then I'm letting fat just sort of fill in the rest, whatever the rest of the calories I need in order to feel satisfied and fuel my body. Fat fills in the rest of that, but it's ending up putting me around 20 to even sometimes 25% protein in my diet, with the rest of it mostly being fat. And I feel great. I mean, my workouts, I've suddenly sort of gotten over some humps that I've just been really stuck on for a while, and I'm convinced now, anecdotally, I know that it's because I just was inadvertently avoiding protein just for the sake of trying to keep my insulin in control, and it's just because I didn't know what I know now.
And so would you say that your breakdown around 25% protein, would the fat be 70% and the rest carbohydrate? Or
yeah, probably it's probably around 65 to 70%, and then that just depends. That's where I end up being such a pragmatist in some regards, where I have my family and I just don't want my diet to be too strange for the rest of the family. But even still, breakfast and lunch are always, I'm totally in control of. It's what I want to eat. Because it doesn't change the family very much, the family dynamic. So if it's one morning and I'm making oatmeal for the kids, because they never get cereal, I'm totally in charge of breakfast and I make it every morning. And so if I make them oatmeal, I'm at the stove and I'm stirring the pot, making the steel cut oats. I won't eat the oatmeal. I'll either fast that morning, I'll make my own sort of cocoa tea drink with some egg yolks in it, or bacon and eggs or whatever for me that morning. But I'll control my own breakfast, I'll control my own lunch, and then if I can do low carb with a focus on fat and protein for dinner and it not disrupt the family dynamic, then I will. But if it's awkward, then I'll just eat what the family's eating.
I really like this information, because when we train athletes, I typically put them on a higher fat diet, but then occasionally we have athletes who come in who are already, say they eat paleo or they're experimenting with ketosis and their fat is incredibly high. And that's something that I have found is they'll come in with these, 85, 90% fat diets. And it's like, well, you're getting next to no protein. And so it's really good to know about this relation here.
Well, it's, mind you, and so I don't intend to speak as an authority on this. There are people that undoubtedly would be better capable to speak about this. But the combination of my own personal interest and just going through the history of this research, I was amazed at how much is out there and what has already been found. In that one particular study with the arginine infusion in low carb or high carb states, finding that in a low carb state, arginine, again, the most insulinogenic of all amino acids, did nothing to insulin. That blew my mind. And now, even still, Jared, before we leave that topic, our obsession with ketones, we need to appreciate how a ketone's even made. And if someone's avoiding protein because they don't want to inhibit ketogenesis, they should. They're actually still kind of getting it wrong. To even make a ketone, you have to have this sort of recipe. All the ingredients have to be there to make the ketone. One absolute essential ingredient. One thing, insulin has to be low. Absolutely. The next thing, glucagon has to be elevated. You cannot make a ketone if glucagon isn't stimulating that process either. So glucagon is essential to ketogenesis. And then third, you have to have sufficient carnitine. And carnitine is a molecule that any mammal will make. We're making it on our own all the time, but you have to have enough. And so Dennis McGeary found, another one of these awesome scientists, he found that if animals were fed a diet that was deficient in carnitine, their ability to produce ketones was limited. And then by just adding carnitine to the diet, all of a sudden ketogenesis ramped up. And when you look at this combination of this recipe, low insulin, high glucagon, and carnitine being available, you end up getting to meat, where you eat meat. And meat ends up, anyone who's eating a low-carb diet and meat ends up being a primary part of their diet, they're already doing what I'm saying, because the average hamburger, it's like a ratio of, 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 of protein to fat, where there is so much more protein in meat than there is fat. And so what I'm saying may be sort of upsetting to some, but if someone's already low carb and it's mostly meat or eggs, like any carnivore keto is already doing this. they're eating way more protein than they think they are, or maybe they know, and that's why they're doing it. But meat is primarily protein, and then lesser so it's fat. So they're already kind of focusing on focusing on protein and letting fat just fill the rest. And you could add butter to it and oil and stuff and up the fat content. But nevertheless, meat ends up in a low carb state providing this perfect recipe for ketogenesis, where insulin's staying low, glucagon is suddenly ramped up 2 or 3 times from the meat, and you're providing exogenous carnitine, which the liver has to have in order to make the ketone. So anyway, it ends up all this experiment has given me an appreciation for protein and a renewed appreciation for, am I eating enough meat?
And I think that's very fascinating stuff. What comes to mind, and I don't know if you have any data, on further amino acids, but one common recommendation, especially in the athletic world, is if you're going to do, say, time restricted feeding, but you wanted to train in the morning, would be to have some sort of branch chain amino acid, either before or after, or before and after training, for protein synthesis and everything else. So you're not worried about muscle degradation, basically.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, I guess it would depend on the amino acid specifically, but do you know if BCAAs increase insulin? You said you have some research that they don't.
Yeah, no, now, Jared, this is a little bit of ignorance on my part. Is leucine? So leucine, I know, is, at least I think, is one of the more common amino acids for anabolism at the muscle. Is that a branched chain amino acid? It is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think leucine did have there was a study from Roger Unger that looked at different amino acids and their insulinogenic effects, and leucine was one of them, but none of them were as substantial as arginine. Now, I don't know the degree to which a typical bodybuilder is focusing specifically on arginine, but if the focus is to increase insulin, arginine would be the one, at least in that very particular context. But yeah, I don't know the individual amino acids and the branched chain amino acids among them. I don't know the specific insulin effect of those.
Okay, yeah, that's something I'm definitely just writing down the name, and I'm definitely going to look into that because I think that's really, really fascinating, because some people could, depending on their goal, making a mistake or doing themselves a huge favor by taking those BCAAs. Awesome. All right, so let's move on to a topic that we kind of also hit on last time, but we didn't go in as deep as I would like to. And that is, you call it, and I love this phrase, the plagues of prosperity. I absolutely love that. And I love to give the most practical information I can should I say, extract the most practical information I can. So what are you seeing right now? The plagues of prosperity, which ones specifically could we maybe point out to some people listening and help them avoid?
Yeah. So I had already mentioned that insulin resistance, this is not just because I'm the man with the hammer, so everything's a nail, but insulin resistance is the most common disorder worldwide, where we have half of the adults in the U.S., half of adults in Mexico, about half in Canada, my native land. And then when you look at I was asked to give a talk in Kuwait and Oman about diabetes and insulin resistance. This was in the summer sometime, so a handful of months ago now. And I was really surprised by this invitation. And I thought, as I was preparing that talk, I wanted to kind of target it to the audience. It was a bunch of physicians and nurses. And by preparing the talk and wanting it to be more audience specific, I found that if you look at the top 10 countries with type 2 diabetes, where it's the worst, and type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. It's just their own insulin. They're so resistant to their own insulin that despite being hyperinsulinemic, their blood glucose levels have finally started to climb. And now once the glucose gets to a certain point, then we define them, now you've got type 2 diabetes. Now the tragedy in that, of course, and this is a bit of a tangent, is that if we defined type 2 diabetes as a disease of insulin, we could detect the disease a decade before the glucose starts to change. But that's just another consequence of us being focused on glucose, but not insulin, when it's actually a disease of insulin. Nevertheless, so if you looked at the top 10 countries with the most diabetes, the first 9 are in Northern Africa and the Middle East, and then number 10 is Mexico. So this is a problem that has happened. Southeast Asia and Northern Africa are going to have the biggest booms of diabetes. But half of all adults in China, half of all adults in India, they're all insulin resistant or pre-diabetic. So that one alone should be on someone's radar, where if someone's going in to get a medical checkup, we have got to just be insisting that our medical practitioners, the nurse or whoever's doing it, that they measure our insulin, that we just somehow check that box to put insulin on our own radar, and in so doing, forcing our health practitioners to be measuring insulin as well. It is without a doubt the most overlooked blood marker that we could be getting. Nevertheless, I'd say if we look at the plagues of prosperity in a more general sense, I'd say one of the most, other than type 2 diabetes and stuff where we're looking at that as a glucose problem when it's actually an insulin problem, other than that one, I'd say hypertension is almost always a consequence of someone's insulin resistance. And so when we're giving a patient with hypertension antihypertensive medications to try to control their electrolytes and their water and force the kidneys to urinate more water out, if that person simply just gets a control of their insulin, almost always the hypertension starts to resolve itself. And it's because we're actually addressing the problem. But back to type 2 diabetes, I guess I thought I wasn't going to say anything about it, but I can't help it. Because we look at type 2 diabetes as a glucose disease, a lot of our medications ignore what's happening to insulin because it does control their glucose. Like, for example, giving a type 2 diabetic a drug in the family of sulfonylureas. That's a drug that forces the beta cells of the pancreas to produce even more insulin than it would normally be able to produce. And so the person has had their insulin climbing over time as they're becoming more and more resistant to their own insulin. And then their glucose starts to climb, and their own insulin is no longer enough to keep their glucose in check. That's why it started to rise. Then we put them on a sulfonylurea, and we bump their insulin up even higher than it should have ever been. We're making their pancreas produce even more insulin. And yet we don't care about that in most clinical settings. I shouldn't say that. To be fair to the physician, I shouldn't say that. Often we look at this as just sort of, well, that's unfortunate, but oh well, because it is lowering their glucose, and that's the primary outcome. We just want to bring their glucose back in control. But it fails to consider that all of the other pathologies that are happening in this type 2 diabetic, like hypertension, like the increased risk of heart disease, the increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, increased risk of cancer, that has far less to do with the glucose than it does the rising hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. And so by giving a type 2 diabetic insulin, by giving them a sulfonylurea, we're just making the whole problem worse. We're just making them that much more insulin resistant, gaining weight, increasing their risk of cancer. We know that. That's published. You give someone sulfonylureas and their risk of cancer will go up 30 to 40%. And you give them insulin, there's a study to show that the risk of cancer goes up by 90% in type 2 diabetics. I mean, this matters. And yet we say, oh, well, we're controlling the glucose. Who cares if it's at the expense of the insulin? No, the insulin matters. Insulin's what's setting the tone for the disease, for type 2 diabetes and all the other plagues.
That makes me wonder what your stance on just is there any value if you don't have diabetes in testing, finger pricks, testing blood sugar and seeing where you're at?
Yeah, so not so much unless you're planning it after like a meal. If you're eating a starchy meal and then you're going to track your blood glucose, that would really be the only benefit, frankly, where that kind of can reveal some problem with glucose tolerance, which is sort of a surrogate of insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. So yeah, if someone only had a finger prick available to them, like a glucose monitor, I'd say doing it after a meal and seeing, do I get back down to my fasting blood glucose in about 2 hours? 90 minutes to 2 hours. If so, then I'm doing all right. But frankly, despite me saying we shouldn't be chasing ketones, someone measuring their ketones is also able to get a surrogate of their insulin, because if your ketones are elevated, for absolute certain your insulin is low. Those two cannot happen in a normal diet. I mean, by that I mean assuming the person's not drinking ketones, where you can sort of you can change all the dynamics entirely in that case. But nevertheless, if you're not drinking your ketones, if your ketones are elevated when you measure on the blood stick, then my insulin's in control. And that's the main reason that I ever check my ketones. Mind you, not very commonly. I just don't get that deep into it to care enough of what my ketones are at any moment. But I do it because I want to know, yep, my insulin's in control. What I'm doing is working. Because like I said, the two cannot be together at the same time. If ketones are high, that has to mean insulin is low.
Well, that's very interesting. That's a good way to potentially self-test, other than having to go get a blood test. I think that's very, very interesting. And, one thing you mentioned when you do going back to time-restricted feeding, you're talking about thinking a lot more clearly. Mm-hmm. Why is that such a big benefit when we're not consuming carbohydrates?
Yeah, it's so interesting. When I start talking about dementias in my class that I teach my undergraduates, a bunch of future nurses and doctors, when I get to that section, dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease and then Parkinson's, I ask the students, what's the primary fuel for the brain? And they all say glucose. I mean, this is just, we know it, it's fact. There's no question. And yet I show them the data from earlier studies from decades ago, that in a fasted state, what becomes the primary fuel, and it's ketones. And I say, well, isn't it interesting that the brain begins to primarily use ketones as ketones start to go up in the body? And even though the person is still, even if a fasting person is still normoglycemic, their glucose levels are still normal. And I say, well, there's still plenty of glucose there. Why doesn't the brain just keep using all the glucose? But as the ketones start to rise, the brain starts to actually use more ketones. To me, that suggests the brains prefer ketones. And again, my reasoning is that if as ketones go up, brain ketone use starts to go up to the point where it ends up being about 75 or 80% of all the fuel that the brain is using. I mean, that's a pretty substantial increase. And someone could argue with that, and I would absolutely respect any other opinion. But to me, the fact that brain ketone use goes up as blood ketones go up, if not suggesting a preference for ketones, it certainly suggests the brain just simply uses what's there. It has no preference for one or the other. That would maybe be the null hypothesis, is the brain just uses what's available. And nevertheless, we know from multiple studies in humans and rodents, as ketones go up, as brain ketone use climbs, cognition improves. We know that. You can infuse ketone analogs into patients with Alzheimer's disease, and in real time, we're seeing improvements in their cognitive tests as they're doing like the clock dial test, drawing a picture of a clock, or they're trying to read words they've not read before, or they're trying to remember a list. It goes up. We know it. We know that it happens. We've seen it. It's published. Animals, they perform better in mazes, and they can remember which part of the radial arm maze they want to go down to get the food. And so these are this is science. I mean, these are data. And why might that be? I don't know why the brain is apparently working better when it's fueled more by ketones. It could be a combination of reduced oxidative stress. We know that ketones are used and they're used to create ATP, the main sort of chemical currency for energy in the body, and producing less oxidative stress at the same time, as opposed to the nerve using glucose. So some people, there's a publication that refers to it as a cleaner burning fuel, where it has less of this pollution as oxidative stress. But it also may be that ketones increase the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. And this is a protein that's becoming even talked about in pop culture, where BDNF helps maintain neuron health and vascularization. It helps maintain basically the health and integrity of the neurons. And ketones do that. Ketones turn that on. So anyway, it could be a combination of these or factors that I'm not even considering, but it doesn't change the fact that in humans, we have data that cognition is improved when ketones are elevated.
And you can get that benefit from something as simple as time-restricted feeding?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it would depend on the inherent insulin sensitivity of a person. The more insulin sensitive you are, the faster you're going to be into a ketogenic state, because your insulin it's coming down that much faster. If we had two people and one person, their last meal was sort of a mixed macronutrient meal, that the insulin sensitive person, his insulin may come down in 30 minutes or 60 minutes, and he's right back down to baseline, and thus ketogenesis would begin shortly after. And then the insulin resistant person, their insulin may be elevated for hours afterwards, and ketogenesis can't start until that's down. But it also has to do with how much glycogen they have in the liver too. And I don't know the dynamics of that, but there has to be some degree of clearing out of liver glycogen before ketogenesis really becomes more potent.
Well, I appreciate that. And that's the reason I ask is really out of personal interest, and a lot of questions I get is because there's so much interest in ketosis and information and research being done that, and for good reason, with a lot of the health benefits that it provides. But one of the big reasons I like to pursue it, or dive into a little bit more, are the cognitive benefits that I have experienced when I do experiment with it. So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, ditto.
All right, what is we're going to go ahead and roll to the quickfire questions of the show, if that's okay with you.
You bet.
All right, what is the hardest workout you've ever done?
Oh man, yeah, anything legs. Frankly, I bet I said the same thing last time. Now I will say, Jared, when I turned 40 a few months ago, I decided just for kicks to mix it up a bit. And, I was experiencing the normal sort of aches that I would get, I had for years. And I decided, I'm a pretty small guy, much to my chagrin. My sisters would tease me and say I'm petite, and I'd respond and say, no, I'm lean. But the fact is, I am in fact I'm a little petite, much to my chagrin, as I said. So I found that I was always trying to, deadlift more. I want to get to 350 for my deadlift, and I'm 150 pounds. That's a lot. I mean, people do it, but not me, or not very easily. And so I found like I was chasing goals that I don't think were really well suited to my physiology. And so just for kicks, I said, just for the next year, I'm going to focus strictly on calisthenics. And I made a few calisthenic goals where I want to be able to get up from a seated position, put my hands down, rotate my backside up and out, and get to a handstand, and then do an honest to goodness handstand push-up. I wanted to be able to do a one-arm push-up, which I could do that as a kid, but I never could do a handstand. I couldn't hold a handstand, or I could maybe have done a handstand push-up when I was younger against a wall, but I didn't have the balance for it. Anyway, so it's been these new, be able to do 10 pistol squats in a row without needing to balance myself on each leg, So some new goals that it has been so much fun to just totally mess around with my workout. And but those workouts haven't been. So your question was what's been the hardest? Really would be sort of any leg day, where it's deadlifts and squats. And so I've kind of brought in a different answer here, which is my latest sort of real enthusiasm for calisthenic workouts, and just appreciating them in a way that I haven't in a long time, if ever. I mean, I've never been able to hold a handstand, partly because I never cared enough. And now I can hold it for like 5 seconds, which for me is amazing. But another thing, Jared, have you ever tried doing a floor L sit? When you put your hands down on the floor. Yeah. And, oh my goodness! I thought I'll work that into my core workout. I couldn't do it. I could not hold my feet at that perpendicular to the floor angle. I could just kick my feet up and hold it just as it would fall. Kick it up and hold it as it would fall. And now I can hold it for about 3 seconds, and I want to get to 30 seconds. But what I concluded is that, because I considered myself pretty strong and I had strong abs, is that when it comes to that sort of movement, an L sit or something, anytime you're sort of pressing the legs, up towards your head, it is a little bit of ab, but it's also a lot of hip flexor. And my conclusion is that conventional ab workouts, when we sort of went to the crunch, 30 or 40 years ago, and people would say, don't use your legs, you're cheating. I think that we lost something to this sort of fundamental movement of flexion at the waist, like the L-sit is doing. We lost the relevance of the hip flexor in this flexion of the stomach, and I might have been just purely for aesthetics, or maybe the crunch was helping isolate the abs more. But whatever the case may be, my conclusion is conventional ab workouts have left the hip flexors in the dust, and I think that's to our detriment. That might be why people have a lot of hip pain and lower back pain, is that their hip flexors just never get worked anymore, even though they're doing ab workouts. Unless you're elevating your legs up, you're not really going to be getting your hip flexors very much.
I think that's really awesome that you've dove into calisthenics and you're really passionate about it. And I think that's really important to note, especially for anyone listening, is the absolute strength, which is just how much weight can you put on that barbell, and then pull versus relative strength, which is how strong you are in relation to your body. And that is lost, on a lot of people. And that's why gymnasts are so impressive. People don't understand the years and years of work it takes to just do like 1% of what they can do, in the Olympics. And it really is impressive. It's a completely different ball game, and you got your work cut out for you, because it is a long journey.
I know.
to master
but it's been a lot of fun. I look forward to my workouts so much more. I just gotten a little stale, I think, and this has really just lit a new fire under me. It's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. I think that kind of blending the two is where you get the most bang for your buck, later on.
I think so. I agree.
All right. If you could nope, I almost skipped one. In your opinion, what's the best activity for building mental toughness?
Yeah. Here, okay, I'm playing with your kids. So, my little boy, and I do mean it in all honesty. There's a level of patience that has any parent with little kids knows this. Sometimes playing with your kid is, you'd rather have bamboo shoots jammed in your fingernails than sit and play with your kid. Where, like, my little boy, my 4-year-old, he'll say, "Daddy, let's play Lego," and he's got his own set of rules, and he wants to do it a very specific way, and yet, man, you just sort of bite your tongue. You let him be in charge for that 30 minutes, for this playtime. And I tell you what, that'll build mental toughness. You let your kids be in charge of 30 minutes of an activity, and you'll want to lose your patience every 2 minutes. At least I do. Maybe because I'm a jerk inherently. I just have to fight harder to control my sort of natural man. But yeah. This is an unconventional answer. I know. I'd say build mental toughness by letting a kid be in charge of an activity, and you totally let them be in charge.
No, yeah, I practice that mental toughness on a daily basis with my kids, and it's definitely, I think just the whole parenting endeavor is a great practice for mental toughness. It
sure
definitely
is.
builds resilience and builds you into a better person for sure.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, you have to become better. It's a refiner's fire.
All right. Now, I'm very interested on this question because of your newfound passion for calisthenics. So if you could only have one piece of equipment to train with for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Yeah, so I've been anticipating this question, and I'm sort of stuck between a pull-up bar and parallel bars. As I'm using the parallel for bar dips and L-sit and practicing an L-sit and kind of manipulating up into a handstand position. And all those sort of horizontal challenges you can. So you know what? I think, despite what I thought, I'll say the parallel bars. I think that's what I would go with right now. If I could only pick one thing, because I could probably find ways to do a lot of the hanging, modified, albeit, that I would do on a pull-up bar. But that's what I'll go with.
Maybe we could build you like some really high ones to where you can still be able to get the pull-ups done. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, now the question of the show, what is the best advice you have for becoming a better human?
Yeah, so here's the latest. And again, it's something I'm working on. It's just listen. And that gets back to what I said earlier, where you seek first to understand. And this is, I'm trying to do this more as a professor, where when a student raises their hand to ask a question, actually let them say everything they want to say. And so anyway, to sum it up in a word, to be a better human, listen.
I really love that answer, and especially having been in some academic settings where the professor does not. They know what you're going to say before you say it, even if they don't. And
Yep, I know what you mean.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Bikman, I always have a great time talking with you, and really, I do learn a lot in these conversations. So I appreciate your time. And is there anywhere that people could, go check you out or learn more about your work?
Yeah, you bet. So because as a scientist, not all of us have the benefit of studying something that people care about or that want to know and get updates about. I am blessed in that regard. So I do have a social media presence. People can find me on Facebook, where I have a profile page, Benjamin T. Bikman. They can find me on Instagram and Twitter it's Ben Bikman, PhD.
Awesome. And we'll link to those in the show notes so you can go check all that out for anyone listening. Dr. Bikman, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks, Jared. This was great. Time well spent. Thank you.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best.